No one expected the hearing to start with a question about white supremacy. But Jasmine Crockett had waited long enough to pretend it wasn't the elephant in the room. The hall was crowded, journalists with their cameras ready, interns clutching their notepads, aides whispering about damage control before the first gavel even struck. And in the middle of it all sat Donald Trump, invited under the pretense of discussing election security but very aware this was about something bigger. The chair banged the gavel, and the session came to order. Trump leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, lips curling into that familiar smirk he wore when he believed no one would dare hold him to account. That was the moment Jasmine adjusted her microphone. The air shifted, like everyone in the room felt gravity change. "Mr. Trump," she began, her voice low but carrying to every corner of the chamber, "you've insisted for years that you've never encouraged bigotry. But in 2017, when you said there were very fine people on both sides, you handed legitimacy to a movement that had been waiting for a president to bless it. White supremacists. Neo-Nazis. Proud Boys." He didn't blink. He didn't look away. But his jaw tightened, just enough that everyone noticed. "You legitimized white supremacy," Jasmine said again, her words hitting like a hammer. "And today, I'm putting that on the record." Gasps flickered through the rows of spectators. Phones were already up, streaming live to millions. Trump leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You don't know what you're talking about," he shot back, voice rising. That was taken out of context. Jasmine didn't flinch. She slid a thick folder across the table toward him. "These are your own transcripts. Your own speeches. Your own tweets. If it's out of context, you can correct it, right here, right now." The camera zoomed in. For a second, Trump didn't touch the folder. He stared at it like it might explode. And in that silence, 5, 6, 7 long seconds, the whole country was watching, wondering what he'd say next. This wasn't the usual political theater. This was Jasmine using the microphone like a blade, and she wasn't done. A heartbeat, nobody breathed. Even the aides who normally shuffled papers or tapped their phones were frozen in their seats, waiting to see if Trump would pick up the folder or shove it aside. He finally reached out, one finger pressing against the cover as though he were testing the weight of the evidence. His face didn't change, but everyone could see the calculation behind his eyes, how to spin this, how to deny it, how to make the moment about Jasmine instead of the words she just forced into the open. "You think you're brave," he said finally, voice low but edged with acid. "But you're just another radical who wants to divide this country." Jasmine didn't blink. "Divide it," she repeated, almost like she was tasting the word. "Mr. Trump, you stood in front of the entire nation and refused to condemn men carrying torches and chanting about blood and soil. You spent 4 years reposting their memes, echoing their slogans, amplifying their conspiracy theories. That's not a division I created. That's a sickness you cultivated." A stir moved through the room, reporters scribbling faster, cameras tightening their focus. Even some of Trump's usual defenders shifted in their seats, the discomfort too obvious to hide. She leaned in just enough that her voice turned quiet, intimate in a way that forced everyone to strain to hear. "Do you know how many people have called my office since 2017? How many parents worried their kids were next? How many teenagers who never felt safe again after Charlottesville?" Trump's mouth opened, then closed. The folder sat between them like a live grenade. "I'm not here to perform for cameras," Jasmine continued. "I'm here because when the leader of the free world nods to hate groups, they don't just feel validated. They feel unstoppable." She reached over, tapping the folder with one fingertip. "You can call me radical all you want. But the radical act here is telling the truth when it's easier to pretend you didn't say what you said." Somewhere behind her, a young staffer swallowed hard. Another whispered, "She's going for it." And she was. Because Jasmine Crockett knew this was bigger than any headline, any viral clip, any election cycle. This was about finally saying out loud what millions had been too tired, too scared, or too exhausted to repeat again. That white supremacy hadn't just been tolerated. It had been mainstreamed. And the man in front of her had been its loudest amplifier. Trump shifted in his chair, the bravado draining inch by inch as Jasmine held her gaze steady on him. Around them, the air felt brittle, like one wrong word would crack it all wide open. "Do you want to deny it?" she asked quietly. "I can read the quotes aloud if you've forgotten." She flipped the folder open, her finger gliding down the first page. Her voice didn't rise, but every syllable landed like a slap. "Stand back and stand by. That was what you said when asked to condemn the Proud Boys." October 2020. A hush fell so deep the camera's autofocus could be heard adjusting. She turned the page. And here, August 2017, after Charlottesville, very fine people on both sides. "Do you remember that, Mr. Trump?" He swallowed. His jaw flexed. She laid the folder flat on the table between them, not shoving it at him, not performing, just placing the truth within reach. "History has a long memory," she said. "And no amount of denial is going to bleach these words out of the record." Trump finally straightened, trying to summon the bluster that had carried him through dozens of scandals. "People are tired of your moral lectures," he snapped. "They're tired of this victimhood narrative." For a moment, Jasmine just studied him, the way you might look at a man trying to build a wall out of sand while the tide was coming in. "You think this is about victimhood?" she asked, voice low. "This is about accountability. It's about the fact that when you called them very fine people, they heard permission. When you told them to stand by, they heard orders." Reporters were now standing against the walls, phones recording every second. No one looked away. "You could have walked that back," she went on. "You could have told the truth when it mattered. But you didn't, because you were too afraid of losing their applause." Trump's face reddened, the first crack in his veneer. He leaned forward, hands braced on the table. "I made this country stronger," he hissed. "You people just want to tear it apart." Jasmine didn't flinch. "No," she said. "I wanted to finally look in the mirror." And that was when the tension snapped, when the room seemed to exhale all at once. Because whatever came next, everyone knew they had just watched the moment when the excuses stopped working. The next question didn't come from a journalist or an aide. It came from a young woman in the back row, a local teacher who'd managed to get a press pass. Her voice wavered, but she didn't look away. "Mr. Trump," she called out, "when you were president, did you ever think about what it felt like to have your words used as justification for violence?" Trump blinked, clearly unprepared for a question that didn't come from a political adversary but from an ordinary American. "I think," he started, struggling to find the usual confidence, "that the media has twisted everything I ever said." But Jasmine raised her hand gently, cutting him off without shouting. "Don't do that," she said, her voice deceptively soft. "Don't pretend this is about bad headlines. A synagogue was defaced with your slogans. A mosque was threatened by men waving flags with your name on them. Children have been taunted in playgrounds because of your words." He looked down, jaw clenched. The teacher didn't move. "And let's be clear," Jasmine continued, voice now steadier than ever. "You didn't create white supremacy. But you did give it a bullhorn. You let it feel legitimate. You made it feel proud." The teacher's eyes shone, unshed tears catching the overhead lights. Trump tried to interrupt, tried to find some rhetorical foothold, but there was none left. "Not here. You call this division," Jasmine said, her gaze unwavering. "I call it exposure. You can't fix a sickness by pretending it doesn't exist. You have to name it. You have to confront it." He exhaled sharply. "You want to blame me for everything." "No," she replied evenly. "I want you to take responsibility for anything." A murmur rippled through the room, some gasps, some quiet nods, some eyes turned down in discomfort. "You keep telling people to move on," Jasmine went on. "But maybe the reason you're so desperate to forget is that deep down, you know the truth." She picked up the folder, tapped it once on the table to align the papers, and set it aside, like she was done giving him the courtesy of her documentation. "You didn't just fail to condemn it," she said. "You cultivated it. And the rest of us have been living with the cost." Trump didn't respond. For the first time, it was obvious he had no comeback that wouldn't make it worse. And in that moment, caught between defiance and the dawning realization that no spin could erase what he'd said, he looked smaller than he ever had. The room stayed still, so quiet you could hear someone breathing unevenly in the second row. A young intern standing against the wall felt his hands start to shake. He wasn't even sure why. Maybe because it felt like he was watching something unspinnable. Jasmine didn't rush to fill the silence. She knew that was when the truth had the most room to settle in. And then, almost as if she'd decided to press one more time, she leaned forward, voice lower now, so the cameras had to strain to pick it up. "Do you know how many people have sat in front of me, mothers, teachers, veterans, and told me they don't recognize their own neighborhoods anymore?" Trump's gaze lifted, wary. "Not because of immigrants," Jasmine said, "not because of some imaginary invasion, but because your words turned neighbor against neighbor. Because your rallies were more than politics. They were a permission slip." He shook his head. "That's not fair." "It's not about fair," she replied. "It's about true." A woman in the corner covered her mouth with her hand. One of Trump's aides typed furiously into a phone. And then Jasmine did something no one expected. She reached into her folder and pulled out a single photograph, a snapshot printed on cheap paper. It was a picture of a vandalized community center wall, spray-painted with a swastika, and underneath it, scrawled in block letters, "Trump Nation." She didn't hold it up theatrically. She just laid it flat on the table where everyone could see. "This was 6 miles from my district office," she said, voice steady. "A place where refugee kids get after-school tutoring. Where a janitor comes in early to make sure the heat is working. You tell me, what part of that is fake news?" Trump didn't look at the photo. He didn't look anywhere. Jasmine let the silence thicken. She didn't flinch. She didn't soften. And for one raw moment, just a heartbeat, he looked like a man who finally saw that no slogan could swallow the truth forever. A reporter near the back finally found his voice. He raised his hand shakily. "Congresswoman, do you think this is what America has become?" Jasmine didn't turn to him right away. She kept her eyes on Trump, as if measuring whether he'd even attempt a response. But he didn't. So she exhaled, slowly, and spoke. "No," she said. "I don't think this is what America has become. I think this is what America has always been willing to ignore." You could feel it then, that sharp pull in the room, the collective realization that this wasn't going to end with a polished statement or a handshake for the cameras. Trump shifted in his chair. "That's a pretty bleak view." She finally turned to look at him fully, her expression almost tired. "What's bleak," she said, "is the number of people who will wake up tomorrow and pretend they didn't hear any of this." A beat of stillness. Then she glanced around the committee table, her voice calm but vibrating with something deeper than anger. When the President of the United States paints a target on whole communities, there are consequences. And it doesn't matter how many press releases get sent out afterward saying, "That's not what he meant." Trump opened his mouth, but no words came. His aide stepped forward, whispering frantically, something about time limits, about needing to wrap this up before the evening news cycle. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She placed her hand over the photograph on the table, palm flat. "You know what the real tragedy is?" she asked, softer now. "That a lot of people watching will only care because this moment made them uncomfortable. Not because they've ever cared about the families living with the fallout." Someone near the cameras sniffed back tears. Another reporter typed without looking up, fingers trembling. And Trump, who had spent a lifetime turning outrage into applause, sat there, finally unable to summon either. The chairwoman cleared her throat, her voice strained. We need to move to closing statements. But Jasmine lifted her hand gently, not to interrupt, but to ask for one more breath of space. And somehow, nobody objected. She looked straight ahead, not at Trump now, not at any of the officials crowding the dais, but at the rows of ordinary people sitting shoulder to shoulder, some leaning forward, some clutching phones to their chests, recording every word. When you tell the same lie long enough, Jasmine began, her tone deceptively quiet, people will start to believe it. They'll start to think the neighbor they shared coffee with is an enemy. They'll start to think cruelty is strength. She let her gaze drift back to Trump. You didn't invent that impulse, she said. But you fed it. And you fed it because it worked. The sentence landed like a dropped weight. Trump swallowed hard. I have never encouraged violence, he muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. You don't have to use the word violence, she said. When you use every other word that makes it inevitable. Someone in the press gallery whispered, "Oh my God." It was all being streamed live. All of it. She took a step back, as if she were finished, but then paused. I've heard people say, this is just politics. This is just culture wars. Her voice deepened, the edges raw with a kind of tired conviction that can't be faked. Politics is who gets clean water. Who gets to feel safe. Who gets to walk down a street without worrying if someone thinks they don't belong. She turned her palms up, as if to show she had nothing left to hide. This isn't a game to me. And it shouldn't be to you. Trump's jaw clenched. For a second, it looked like he might stand up and leave the table altogether. But he didn't. And Jasmine, steady as a mountain, just looked at him, waiting to see if he would finally say something real. He didn't. Jasmine finally exhaled, her shoulders dropping half an inch. You could almost feel the pressure in the hearing room shift, like a storm had passed but the air was still charged. Reporters were scribbling so fast their pens clicked off the edges of their notepads. Cameras panned to catch every micro-expression, the tightening around Trump's eyes, the way he pressed his thumb hard against the table, as though bracing himself. Congresswoman, the chairwoman said cautiously, if you're finished. I'm not, Jasmine replied. Not rude. Just factual. She turned back to the audience, because she wasn't talking to Trump anymore. She was talking to everyone who'd been told they were less American, less worthy, less human. My grandfather used to say something, she continued. He said, when people show you who they are, believe them the first time. A low murmur rolled through the gallery. Jasmine set her notes down, empty hands resting on the table. White supremacy doesn't always look like a burning cross, she said. Sometimes it looks like a handshake. Sometimes it looks like a slogan. Sometimes it looks like someone telling you it's just tradition. Trump shifted again, this time visibly unsettled. And when you justify it, she went on, when you pretend it's about patriotism or heritage or anything other than power, you make it stronger. For the first time, her voice lifted, not a shout but a declaration. I won't pretend. I won't co-sign it. And I won't be quiet about it. The silence afterward wasn't just respect, it was something closer to relief. Like people were holding their breath and finally let it go. Trump drummed his fingers. A practiced move to look casual. But his eyes flickered toward the exit. And Jasmine? She just folded her hands, like she had all the time in the world to watch the truth hang in the air. A producer from one of the cable networks was already texting his editor, this is the clip. Air it uncut. You could feel the weight of that moment, like someone had cracked the ceiling and let fresh air pour in. Trump, never one to stay quiet, finally leaned toward his microphone. His voice was low but carried across every corner of the chamber. You know, he began, for someone who talks about division, you sure do enjoy dividing this country. Jasmine tilted her head, her expression almost amused. Division? You mean telling the truth? He waved a dismissive hand. You call it truth, I call it bitterness. You don't love this country. No, she cut in, voice steady but edged now, I love it enough to want it to be better. That line landed like a slap. Even some of the Republican aides froze, glancing around as if unsure how to react. Trump tried to smirk, but it didn't quite hold. You're just another radical who wants to rewrite history. Jasmine leaned forward. I don't have to rewrite it. History is exactly what it is. You just don't want to read the parts that make you uncomfortable. A ripple of murmurs passed through the gallery. Phones were lifted, recording. One woman in the front row wiped a tear from her cheek. Trump sat back, folding his arms. You done? Jasmine gave the smallest nod. For now. Then she looked straight into the cameras, into every living room, every break room, every place where someone had been told they were too loud, too ungrateful, too angry. But if you think this conversation ends here, she said quietly, you haven't been paying attention. In that instant, it didn't matter that Trump was a former president. It didn't matter how many donors or strategists he had behind him. What mattered was that Jasmine Crockett had dared to name the thing most people only whispered about. And nobody watching could look away. As the session adjourned, people didn't rush out the way they normally did. It was like the entire chamber needed a moment to process the collision they just witnessed. Trump gathered his papers with a brittle sort of calm, but his jaw was clenched. Jasmine, meanwhile, stood without hurry, as if she knew exactly what she'd just done, and who she'd done it for. In the hallway, reporters swarmed. One of them, a woman in a cobalt blazer, held up her phone. Congresswoman Crockett, what do you say to Americans who think calling out white supremacy is itself divisive? Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't even glance at Trump, who was standing a few feet away pretending not to listen. She spoke directly into the microphone. I'd say the real division comes from pretending it doesn't exist, she said. I'd say ignoring it is how it stays alive. And I'd say if you're more upset by the fact I named it than by the harm it causes, you should ask yourself why. Someone whispered, she's not backing down, and it was true, she looked steadier now than she had all day. Trump finally turned, leveling that familiar scowl. You're going to regret this, he said, voice low enough only a few could hear. Jasmine gave him a look that wasn't anger, wasn't even pity. Just a calm certainty. No, she replied. I'm not. A beat of silence. Then she walked away, leaving him standing there with all his threats and all his carefully rehearsed indignation. And in that moment, millions of people watching, some who'd never heard her name before, felt something tighten in their chest. A sense that maybe, finally, somebody had said the thing out loud. The next morning, the clip was everywhere. Prime time, morning shows, podcasts. But more importantly, it was in group chats and break rooms and text threads with a single line. Did you hear what she told him? And long after the headlines moved on, that question would echo, proof that sometimes, the simplest truths were the ones that hit the hardest. This wasn't just an argument between two people. This was a moment when a truth that's been lurking in America's heart finally stepped onto the stage. Jasmine Crockett's voice rose without fear of Trump's titles or his crowd. And millions who heard her felt something shift, like a quiet shame or an unspoken question they'd been carrying was finally named. And maybe, for the first time, when people heard the words white supremacy, they didn't just feel discomfort, they saw what it looked like to challenge it. This story wasn't just an expose. It was a reminder that it doesn't matter who holds the microphone, it matters who tells the truth. Remember this, sometimes the biggest change starts when one person looks power in the eye and says, no. You don't get to rewrite reality. Jasmine did that. Now it's on us, not to forget, and not to let it fade. If this story stirred something in you, share it. Because silence always serves the lie.